Football at 4.
You know, something that Jeffrey Lurie said in that bite that brings Moshe in kind of stands out about why this team is where they are, the reason why they think the way they do. We'll get into that and more because Geoff Mosher is here for Football at 4, powered by the Inside the Birds podcast. And, of course, it is brought to you locally by Lyle M. Back. For everything from skincare to cosmetic surgery, go to ilovelylback.com or call 856-MAKEOVER for Dr. Lyle M. Back, proud sponsor of Football at 4. All right, Moshe, let's bring you in here because no trade has happened to this time period, 4 o'clock on the Monday. But what do we think will happen in the next 48 hours here? Do we think something is imminent?
Well, I think the imminent part is that Carson Wentz will be traded. I don't think we've reached a point where he can come back to the organization anymore. However, I think that the longer this lasts, and it could last beyond 48 hours, and that to me would be an indication that what Howie Roseman is asking for in return, he's not getting. So he's hoping to see if anybody else gets involved, if he can leverage one offer against another. I know that, in speaking with sources, both Adam and I have said that Howie is looking for, a good compensation here, more than a first-round pick. Will he get 2 first-round picks? I have a hard time thinking that he will, but I don't blame him for at least trying. And, the longer it goes, the more I would think that if he had even close to that kind of an offer of 2 first-round picks, the deal would have been done already.
So you just said it. The imminent part is Carson Wentz will be traded. Do we get to this point because he just simply doesn't want to be here anymore, or did they make this decision that they're ready to move on from him?
Well, there has to be a first mover, right? I mean, because the answer to your question is yes and yes. But, ideally, I think the Eagles wanted Carson Wentz to not feel the way that he feels right now about the organization and come back and work with the new staff and rebuild himself. But clearly that doesn't seem to be happening, nor is Carson. Are they getting the signals that Carson is ready to do that? So at this point, they're in a position where they don't want to have a disgruntled player, especially a quarterback, coming into camp. So or being part of the team when he doesn't really want to be there. And so now they've got to do this part of it, and then that's pulling him off. And one day when this is all done, we're going to step back and look at all this and say, it's amazing how fast this all really happened. I mean, Carson Wentz has a pretty good rookie year, an unbelievable second year. He doesn't win the Super Bowl, but he got them to the point where he put them in position to win the Super Bowl, came back from the knee injury, had a decent, pretty good year the year after that. And then all of a sudden the regression begins to the point where he's broken. He don't want to be a part of the team. They have to trade him and cut bait. And it's just, as I said on the podcast, it's a total organizational failure that this has happened. Now, that doesn't mean drafting him. People have interpreted that wrong way. Every time I've said that, people have said, but we got a ring out of it. Of course, that part wasn't the failure, not drafting him. But what has happened over the last year and a half to get to this point is a complete failure.
Yeah, it absolutely is. And now that Wentz is going to be gone, does it change your opinion on Doug Peterson being fired? Because it was kind of at the time, are they choosing Carson over Doug? But we did hear that it was a lot to do with the coaching staff and the direction of the offense as a whole. But, you always think in the back of your mind, well, if Wentz isn't here and Doug is, do you feel better about the situation? So just your opinion. Does it change your, opinion now that Doug and Wentz are both fired on the Doug Peterson firing?
It's a good question. My sense in what we reported was that there was far more to the split between Doug Peterson and the organization than just Carson Wentz. That obviously was a big part of it. But the question of why or how, right, Hunter? How did this happen was something that Jeffrey and Doug didn't see eye to eye on, and including how to fix it and rebuild it. And so one of the things we asked Adam and I in our podcast, and we pondered is, let's say you kept Doug Peterson and you knew you were going to be moving on from Carson Wentz anyway. How can you be positive that the next quarterback in line wasn't going to have similar issues with Doug or the coaching staff? Not everybody's the same. I'm not saying it would have happened to Jalen Hurts or anyone else, but if ownership felt that Doug's vision for a coaching staff was not good. And the fact that they had to fire so many coaches, whether it's wide receiver coaches or, offensive coaches along the way, they didn't want to have to keep doing that. And they felt that Doug was not A, hard enough of a coach, and B, not a good enough evaluator of his own coaches. And so you can just insert name here at quarterback. If that's your fear, then really your decision to move on is more than just about the quarterback, It's about how you coach that position in general. And I'm not saying, by the way, that Jeffrey Lurie is right. I'm just laying out here what the obstacles were for both parties there.
Geoff, what do we know in terms of teams involved? How many do we know specific teams at this stage?
Yeah, so what I've been told, and this is pretty consistent from last week when Adam and I were on with you, is that the Bears and the Colts sort of have shown the most interest. It's out there. This is what the league knows. This is what the chatter around the NFL is. I've also heard other teams being involved from both conferences. Now, I can't tell you the level of involvement. I don't know if there's been specific offers made or just calls checked in, just dialogue. But I can tell you that I've heard from several sources that other teams have called in and expressed some interest, or at least had conversations, and from both conferences.
So the Bears and the Colts, Adam has told us that on Friday as well. Those seem to be the teams that are out there the most, right? So of those two, we've heard this wonky thing where Nick Foles is involved. So it sounds like people are at least throwing things out there. Do you feel there's a better match between the two teams? Because you guys over at Inside the Bird said there's a lot of reasons why the Colts make sense. Why would the Bears make sense here?
Well, yes, you're right. Makes sense for the Colts. They have a lot of cap space. They have coaching familiarity with both Doug and Press Taylor going to be there. Great offensive line, which is something that, Carson Wentz has flourished with. I don't know that the Bears are the best situation for Carson Wentz, because you're talking about a team that's very desperate right now. I mean, all those guys were fortunate not to get fired. I'm talking about the GM, Ryan Pace, and the head coach, Matt Nagy, and clearly they don't have a lot of confidence in Mitchell Trubisky, even after he played fairly well when he came back, when he started over Nick Foles. But they've got to win, and they've got to win now, and they know they need a quarterback. So that's probably the best situation potentially for the Eagles as far as maybe getting more in return, because they know, Chicago's feet are to the fire here a little bit. But that doesn't mean that Ryan Pace and the Bears are going to do something stupid. They are desperate, but we've seen the results of desperate trades in the league before. They don't always work out. And it's funny. Someone made a comment to me, someone in the league, that it seems like the younger GMs are getting a little smarter these days. And, Chris Ballard from the Colts is a very smart GM. And for every good game of leverage and using the media that Howie Roseman plays, you have to admire Chris Ballard's, I don't want to call it a game, but the way he's talking in the media, because he has come out and said, look, we're not going to make a move out of desperation. He hasn't denied interest in Carson Wentz, but he's talked about building a program and not making it all about one person, and that there are other avenues to get quarterbacks, and that they think that they can win without having the most dynamic quarterback in the league. Now, that could all be a smokescreen to Howie to say, you're not getting 2 first-round picks to me, but I really do want Carson Wentz. Or you could just take him at face value, because he tends to be a very honest person. So it'll be very interesting to see how this thing shakes out, and if somebody else emerges from the pack here at the last minute because somebody else gets desperate.
Wentz's character has obviously been questioned, along with how coachable he is. Does it tell you anything that DiFilippo in Chicago might want to have his hands on him again? Reich, Press Taylor at Indianapolis want to get his hands on him again. Does that tell you anything?
Well, let's break it down from both sides. If you're the Chicago Bears and everybody's pretty much on notice right now, and you need a quarterback, to win, and you're DiFilippo, you have a rapport with Carson already, and everybody in the world knows that when you were his quarterback's coach is when he played his best football. So if he comes over to the Bears after this terrible year and Carson Wentz has a really good year, how good does that look for John DiFilippo? All of a sudden, you're going to hear John DiFilippo's name next offseason as that rising, not rising, he's been in the league in a while, but as a potential candidate to maybe be a head coach. So there's a lot of reasons for DiFilippo, not just job preservation for this coming year, but also beyond, to want to do that. And then, I think the same thing with the Colts. I know the Colts. I know this. I've been told this from people around the league, that that the Colts know that they've got a really good situation to be able to repair Carson Wentz. Of course, they have Frank Reich there. Of course, they're bringing Press Taylor in, although people maybe in the NovaCare would argue that's not the best situation. But when you've got that offensive line, they have some decent young receivers, have a good defense. I mean, that really is a good scenario for Carson Wentz to try to be rebuilt there.
We're talking with Geoff Mosher from the Inside the Birds podcast. He and Adam Kaplan share what they're hearing about a Wentz trade. And, are they going to get fair market value for him? Or, I mean, are we at the point where anything is fair market value? Or, like, is there a line? Like, we keep asking, is there a line of demarcation for you where you're like,
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's a good question. But any team that's trading for Carson Wentz, whether it's the Bears, the Colts, whoever, they're trading to get a starting quarterback. And they're doing that under the presumption that they're going to fix Carson Wentz and he's going to be a pretty good quarterback. So in that regard, I think a first round pick is a fair ask, especially if you're the Colts or Bears and you don't have a top 5 or a top 10, not even a top 15 pick. So I think that's fair. I think 2 first round picks like Matthew Stafford is not necessarily listen, I get why Howie's off asking for it. But I don't know if that's what he's going to get. And I would be reluctant to give up 2 first round picks for a guy when you're in the back of your mind, whether you're the Colts, the Bears, or anybody else. You do have to wonder if your plan's going to work. You don't know that you're trading for the Carson Wentz of 2016 circa to 2017-18.
Definitely true. So if you walked out, if we said at the end of this conversation, Carson Wentz has been traded and they got a first round pick and a player or 2, did Howie Roseman do a good job by getting a first round pick in return?
Who are the 2 players? Is it a punter and a backup long? No, I'm just, I think so. I think if they can get a first round pick out of this, then it's pretty good. You'll have the 6th overall pick and then another first round pick.
I mean, if it's Indianapolis, it's 21. If it's Chicago, you got 20.
Right. Yeah. I think you'd have to be pretty happy with that. And I couch that as saying, I don't know if you can ever be happy that you just had to go trade the guy that you moved up to number 2 to get, who would have been the MVP most likely in his second year and all that. But at this point, it's about saving face, right, and getting the most that you can get in this kind of sloppy, ugly divorce. So a first round pick, yeah, I would say that would be a pretty good deal for the Eagles to get.
Yeah, I wonder if you're a team on the other side trying to look for Carson Wentz, knowing that the Houston Texans are going to ask for a king's ransom for Deshaun Watson. It's more like you're giving up a ton, but you're getting a more known commodity rather than, hey, we might not have to give up as much for Carson Wentz, but his upside is just as high. Let's go take a risk. Do you think that maybe looking at the market for who's available right now, maybe that intrigues the other side, not so much the Eagles, but who they're talking to?
Yeah, I think the intriguing part is maybe having, if you're Indianapolis, Chicago, or somebody picking outside the top 10 or 15 to potentially get a guy who could play at an MVP level or a Pro Bowl level at least for a bottom or half of the first round pick. That is a steal. I mean, look, if the Rams, for all they gave up, go deep into the playoffs, they win, because that's the whole point. You get Matthew Stafford, you add him to a really good team, right? If somebody gets a Pro Bowl version of Carson Wentz and the most they gave up was like the 21st, 22nd, and maybe even a player that wasn't, vital to what they do, then yeah, that's a win for them.
Yeah, Geoff, one other thing that's kind of like sticking out to me with this whole situation, like you said, like how did they get to this spot where we played 3 years ago today, Jason Kelce got up there and went on this, rambling long thing. He opened up praising Howie Roseman. This guy was thrown down the hall and he came out a different man. And without him, he's the reason why we built this team. Everybody wants him gone. He went on about the coach, how it was the worst hire, Mike Lombardi. He was not equipped. He's gone. And now the quarterback who you drafted to kind of build this whole thing is now out the door too. Like, when we look at this, isn't it a sad story?
Well, when I use the term organizational failure, it is exactly what you just described. You had the highest of the high. Everything was working out, and then it all just went south. Every last bit of it. I mean, throw in the Zach Ertz stuff there too. I mean, that was an ominous beginning to the year with his contract and his feud. And by the way, he's close to Carson. We all know that. And so you wonder if some of that also influenced Carson's thought process on what's going on in Philadelphia. And it really should teach everybody that. And I used to say this in the Andy Reid era. You know, when you cover this team long enough, you know that there's always like a little bit of a level of there's stuff that goes on with the Eagles that you just don't hear about with other teams, right? And when you try to talk about it, people will say, well, yeah, but they've been to the playoffs and they won a Super Bowl and they're good. Well, okay, that just means that they're able to at least, survive and endure it. But it's not necessarily the way you want to live by. And that's the reason why I think the Eagles have been successful. But when they're bad, they tank. I mean, the last year of Andy Reid, this past year, I think 4 of the last 7 years now, they have not been in the playoffs, if I'm not mistaken. So I've wondered this a while.
Well,
is it starting to catch up to them?
Well, I mentioned, I referenced the quote from Laurie where he said, we'll stack our organizational next to anyone, something to that. We looked at it the other day. They have one back-to-back losing season in 20 years. One. Yeah. They went 7-9 in 15 and 7-9 in 16, and then they won the Super Bowl. So people keep asking why Roseman keeps his job, why Roseman. We just went through a bunch of lists of the top GMs in football, and almost every one you find, Roseman is ranked in the top 10.
Yeah, it is pretty interesting.
So it's are we too close to this? And I'm not even a Roseman hater. Like, I don't hate Roseman. I don't think he's this, I think it's more, is it Roseman the human being that people just don't like, meaning inside the building? Forget the fans just hate him for, and I think there's other reasons they don't like him. He's not a football guy, the way he talks, the way he looks, the way he dresses. I think those things are higher on the list of why people don't or factor in why they don't like him more so than because of the way he looks, talks, acts, yada, yada, yada. It makes his draft record that much worse to others. I think Geoff is frozen here, right? Do we got Geoff? Can you hear us? No, Geoff, we lost you. But I think all of that factors into, because I don't like all of these things about him, it factors into how they view him and the job that he does. So once we get Geoff back into the conversation here, I would like to kind of get his take on what do people around the league think about Roseman?
It's a very interesting question. And I do know that there have been some people who, here comes Moshe. Is he back in?
He is.
Yes.
Okay.
I heard the question. I can answer it. Sorry to cut you off, Hunter.
No, it's
right.
fine.
So my question
You're more
was,
important to me.
We got these lists. He's top 10 in most of these lists.
Right.
I feel like people don't like the way he looks, the way he talks, the way he dresses, the way he just – and they don't like that about him, so it compounds the way they feel about the job that he actually does. What do other executives around the league think about the job Howie Roseman does?
Polarizing guy, Mike. Very polarizing. I remember when he went through that feud with Chip Kelly, and I wrote a story about him, Howie Roseman, and how he was viewed around the league. And I had a couple of people who used to work for the Eagles and didn't at the time. And this is just how difficult it is. One guy who used to work for the Eagles in the front office said to me, he couldn't stand Howie. He thought Howie was a paranoid guy and was always worried about someone to come take his job, and that fueled how he went about his job, and he would keep people at bay and not always listen to what they say. But then in the very next sentence, he goes, "But man, I tell you, I learned a lot from him. He's really good at what he does." So that just goes to show you the multi-levels.
Well,
of
how
Howie.
many guys in the league? How many guys in the league are quote unquote Roseman disciples?
Roseman like they came from the
Eagles front office. You got Jason Light, who just built a Super Bowl champion in Tampa, worked here.
Right.
I guess
Brett
Grigson worked here. Brett Veach worked here. Grigson's out, but, I mean, he was in Indianapolis.
Yeah, there are Roseman disciples, but I wouldn't say that they're all you can't call it like the Andy Reid tree because they're not all big fans of Howie Roseman. So I wouldn't put it that way.
Is it like the Billy Bean situation where he's like, you go on the road with these guys because I can't become friends with these guys?
I think it's different. I think Howie even has talked about this, that he's not as detached. In fact, Howie brought up the Billy Bean in his last press conference. He brought that up and said that he's not that type of guy, that he just has a kinship with his players that he respects. And we've seen that with Jason Peters and some other guys that he had, the fat head of Carson Wentz in his office and everything like that. But I'll give you an example of something that just doesn't sit right with me, that reflects on the Eagles front office. And I'm not saying this came from Howie. I'm just going to give you an example. After Doug Peterson got fired, there was a TV reporter who doesn't usually break a lot of news, who had a tweet that said it was his understanding from a source that Howie Roseman wanted to draft Justin Jefferson, but the coaches wanted to draft Jalen Reagor. All right. I have no idea who that came from. That is not true. That's not how I understand it. My understanding, and Adam and I have talked about this, is that Howie was a big fan of Jalen Reagor throughout the process. So, but the bottom line is somebody, and I have to think that came from inside the building from someone, told a reporter who doesn't usually break that kind of news that information that makes Doug look really bad. Like, oh, Doug wanted Jefferson. It also makes Jalen Reagor not look good either. When that happens, that to me is not the sign of a really classy organization. Now, I think the Eagles in general are a classy organization, but in times of adversity, sometimes their true colors show in those little ways, and that would bother me if I were, Doug, if I were Jalen. I mean, I just think that was bad. That did not look good.
So do you think, again, like the problem is that people that work there, players or people, have more of a problem with Howie than Howie does a bad job?
I think that there's there's probably something to be said to that. I would argue that part of your job is your ability to work well and have a staff and listen to them and be a leader and a cohesive type of
What
figure.
are some of the things that Roseman does that's an asset to this team that is overlooked because I think the fans are so fixated on the draft, and specifically, like we got a guy who says, "Wait, you guys are crazy. Passing on DK is fireable." Well, every team in the league passed on him. He got drafted in the second round. So every team's GM then should now be fired because every single team at one point passed on DK Metcalf. But I think a lot of
does your caller is your commenter using that as an example, or is he saying that in itself is a fireable offense? Because
it seems like that in itself is a fireable
there you
offense.
Go.
No, that
Big
in itself
D,
is
watch
not
it
a
on
fireable
YouTube. You
offense.
can see it up on the screen for yourself. You guys are crazy. Passing on DK is fireable.
No, I mean, that's clear. That in itself is not fireable, especially if they were going with their medical grade, and it's my understanding they were on that. I mean, there are other good players also that they passed on in that draft that you can throw all of that, and obviously their recent draft history has not been very good. But he obviously manages the cap well up until this year where they're going to be over, but he told you why with trying to win the Super Bowl again, and he is normally very good at trades. He knows the league very well. And in the draft, even though his drafts have been questionable lately, he's very aware of the clusters that certain players are going to go and where they're going to fall to. So, he's not the worst GM in the league. He's not. He's just, I would say, not the best. And he's got some flaws that hold the team back, and he does some good things that help the team. So that's the whole dichotomy of Howie Roseman right there.
I think one thing in football, too, Broads and I were bringing this up. If I was to say who's the best GM in football, I don't think fans just start rattling guys off. And that's part of the thing is fans don't start rattling off who the best are. And if you start to talk to people in the league and they start to rattle off who the best is, Roseman's name comes up.
It depends on who you talk to.
Correct.
Yeah. I mean, there are certainly guys in Roseman's position in the league that think that he's not the best GM and have had issues with him. So, I mean, that's what makes it polarizing.
Is that more because they just don't like him?
I don't know.
That guy does such a horrible job. I don't know how anybody thinks he does it.
It seems more relationship-wise, more so like, how he relates to people, how he talks to people, communicating more so than the X's and O's of the GM, if you will.
Right.
Right. Nobody's ever said to me, that guy is a terrible GM. He doesn't know what he's doing. It's been said to me that he has real issues with relationships with people, and that could end up being a downfall, or it makes it a difficult environment to work in, which is a totally different way of saying he's bad at what he does.
Another, Jeff, and you can talk about this too, is the fact that he's polarizing in himself on what he's done and what he hasn't done. You know, when he ran the draft, when he didn't run the draft, which picks is he responsible with? You know, at the end of the Reed era, we talked about this before when Reed was drafted, and then he had some bad drafts, and Laurie had that press conference, and he's like, well, we had Reed's board, and now we're going to use Roseman's board. Well, if they went off Roseman's board, he picked Fletcher Cox, and he picked Brandon Graham, and he picked Zach Ertz, and he picked Lane Johnson. So he's got a ton of guys that he can say, I picked these guys, but who knows when he did. And then during the years when people want to give the Super Bowl team credit, who do they give credit to? Well, it was Joe Douglas. Well, then does Joe Douglas get blamed for how bad those drafts were post-Super Bowl?
Yeah, no, there's a lot of dart throwing that goes on.
We'll never know.
You don't judge a guy by individual. You don't judge a guy like just by a draft or just by free agency. You judge it by the totality. And you mentioned the difference in who had power when. So lost in this conversation about, you know, some of the things that go on with the Eagles that are maybe not the best or not the healthiest. We didn't really talk about Jeffrey Lurie. And certainly that's the guy who puts people in the positions that they're in and enables things that goes on because he's the owner and it happens under his watch. And, you know, there'll be people who tell you that just like Howie, there'll be people who tell you that they think Jeffrey is a great guy, a wonderful owner because he supports you. He gives you resources, great facilities. But then when they start to talk about some of the decision-making that goes on and his hand and his fingerprints on things, they'll say, well, that's not such a great thing, which is the story of the Eagles, really.
Well, the story for the Eagles will have to be on pause for this Football at 4 segment. And if you want to hear more about the Eagles, check out the Inside the Birds podcast. They got a new one that dropped this morning. And tomorrow we'll do more Football at 4. Jeff will be back on Wednesday. Adam Kaplan's here Friday. Andrew's here tomorrow. We got a lot on this Wentz stuff, so keep it locked to 97.3 ESPN. All right, Jeff. Good one today.
Take care, fellas. Thanks.
All right, man. He, like all guests, appeared via the Boardwalk Honda hotline.